Well, as far as I'm concerned, I came to discover that Noah's flood is the most derided story in the scripture. It has the largest version of mockery in the popular media as well as the entertainment industry. So I'll give it a shot trying to change that. I need first of all to mention something which touches on epistemology. That is the way we know things, the science of how we know things. Humans are limited in their knowledge by the natural laws, the so-called laws of nature. If the laws of nature would not be there, we cannot explain the world, can we? We cannot even study it. Question is, if you're a believer, you have to answer the following question. Was God bound by the natural laws as He created? In other words, were the natural laws limiting the possibilities of creation? The answer obviously is not. No, He was not limited. Actually, the natural laws might not even be there during the 6 days of creation or functioning in a different way. God created them as He went. And once creation was finished, the natural laws were in place. It is from that moment on that we can scientifically explain things. There's no way that we can explain creation scientifically because that's beyond science. It didn't function according to the natural laws that we know today. So therefore you cannot use science to discredit creation because you have no tools either. The flood is not... It happened afterwards, so the world was functioning already according to the laws of nature. In addition to that, it was not a miracle. Because again, a miracle goes against the laws of nature, therefore it cannot scientifically be explained. The flood is just a huge geological event. Therefore, we should be able to explain it. Of course, many Christians raise this issue. Was it local or global? What does it matter? Does it make a difference for the gospel? Of course it does. First of all, I already mentioned this in my first talk, but let me just go over it again. The gospel mentions a global flood. Here's Jesus, right? Remember? It also, the description in Genesis is that of a global flood. There's very little doubt about it if you read it. Then, if it was a local flood, God cannot be trusted. And the gospel is unreliable. Remember the argument of logic and theology that I used before. The entire episode of the Tower of Babel and the consequent dispersion of human population is irrelevant if there wasn't a global flood, if there wasn't a bottleneck to reduce all the population down to 4 couples. And then, there should be no stories, myths, legends about a global flood outside the Middle East, if this was a local Middle Eastern story, right? We will look into that later. But first let me share with you the history of catastrophism in geology. Catastrophism in the beginning of geology was by all means accepted as an obvious thing. But then there was one last final battle between Georges Cuvier, the director of Natural History Museum in Paris, and Charles Lyell, one of the fathers of modern geology, after he wrote his 3 volumes of the Principles of Geology. Now, Cuvier was the world's best anatomist, and he was studying the fossils in the Paris Basin, and he could see repeated levels of mass killing, mass death in the fossils, so-called extinctions. And he was convinced that they were actually evidence for repeated catastrophes. On the other hand, Charles Lyell believed in uniformitarianism, or in philosophical terms, actualism, in the sense that all the geological processes of the past are the same with the ones that we see today. And since today we can only see slow unfolding processes, all the processes in the past were also slow. Consequently, there have been no catastrophes in the geological past. There's more to this thing than just geology, because the year, or the period of time, is very important. 1835. What happens here is the following. The greatest fear of the British has been just taken care of. Talking about Napoleon, right? So now, England is spreading its culture, its empire throughout the world. And one of the things that seems to have mattered a lot is the idea that the English culture, civilization, brings consistency, constancy, peace, a regular system. So why not have geology functioning the same way? I'm pretty convinced that there's such an element in it. I'm just wildly guessing, but I'm convinced nevertheless. Now, all the way, because it was actually Lyell who won this famous war, and since 1835, nobody would ever dare mention catastrophes in geology. I remember the years, several months actually, I worked at the Natural History Museum in Paris, that the scientists there had a sort of a self-censorship. I noticed it very clearly that they were afraid to mention anything that would even hint at catastrophe in geology. Everything had to be nice and smooth. So complete was Lyell's victory. It was lingering after 100 and some years. Well, the Americans were more immune to this in a way, not too much more, but still enough. So in 1925, Harlan J. Bretz, an American geologist, published a paper in the Journal of Geology about the Channel Scallions, which is this territory here in Washington State. And he claimed that the Channel Scallions were the result of a gigantic flood. Now that created quite a stir-up, and the whole geological community went into a fit, and they attacked the poor guy, they ridiculed him, they ostracized him, and eventually he had to give up entirely all this area of geology and moved into karstology for my benefit, because I used a lot of his papers later on in that particular domain about karst and caves. The best specialist in geomorphology of those days went into the field in Washington State, and he looked for evidence for a flood, and he came back 3 weeks later saying there's nothing in there whatsoever that might even hint to a catastrophe. So it's clear that Mr. Bretz is crazy. Today he's a national hero. Well, we know now what happened. You see in blue here, you see the estimated edge of the southern edge of the Cordilleran ice sheet. It was the ice sheet that was covering during the Ice Age Vancouver Island, plugging completely the Georgia Straits and covering all the mountains from west coast east to the Rockies, then connecting to the Laurentide ice sheet across Canada, across into Greenland, across Iceland, and eventually Europe and Asia. Now, as the ice was melting towards the end of the Ice Age, a lot of meltwater accumulated, coming from underneath the ice. And the research I've done in British Columbia has also revealed the fact that there have been repeated volcanic eruptions underneath the ice, which has further produced huge pulses of meltwater. So at some point, this lake here, known as Lake Missoula, around the town of Missoula in Montana, you can still see about 7, 8 ancient shore levels of the lake in there. And this lake was actually the result of repeated damming of the natural drainage of the water by the ice slopes here, so there were ice dams. But with these pulses of meltwater coming from BC, at some point, those dams gave up, and the water was released, roughly 1,600 cubic kilometers of water. In places, there's evidence now, clear evidence, that the waterfront reached a whole kilometer vertically. And the speed was somewhere around 150, 160 kilometers per hour, in places up to 200 kilometers per hour. The water end cut, excavated or carved, if you wish, the Channel Scallions very quickly. Then the Columbia River Gorge and went into the Pacific. Here's some pictures. There's a satellite image of the Channel Scallions, and here are some local pictures. This is the Grand Coulee downstream from the Dry Falls. This is the Burlingame Canyon, and up there is my favorite. What you see there are ripple marks. Now, ripple marks, you can see often ripple marks on the banks of the rivers or lakes, undulating sand, caused by the waves. They're called ripple marks. About knee high. These ones are 10 meters. They're crying out catastrophe. You can clearly see that. I mean, the gigantic drainage happened down this, which is not the river, but it was much bigger than that. And that is the thing that has caused this ripple marks. There's plenty of ripple marks throughout the Channel Scallions. But the geomorphologist of the day was so blinded by his bias against the catastrophe that he didn't see it. Another major flood happened here in central Canada and eastern Canada as well. You see, as the ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet, was melting, of course, a lot of meltwater accumulated at the edge in the shape of a huge glacial lake, or pro-glacial Lake Agassiz. For the sake of the record, Louis Agassiz was a Swiss geologist who first discovered evidence for the Ice Age in Europe. And then he came to America to check out if there were any traces of glaciation in here too, which he of course found all across North America. And then he was offered a position at Harvard and he stayed there. And he founded the first geology seat in there. And Agassiz, by the way, was a creationist, and he had some major arguments with Darwin. Darwin didn't believe in his Ice Age initially. Now, as the ice was melting and the ice sheet became lighter, the lake, which normally drained through the ancient Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, suddenly drained in catastrophic releases. A part of the water went underneath the ice, as a cross-section. So literally lifted a bit the ice, but there was already some space in there, so the water was slowly making its way into the Hudson Bay. Now imagine this space here. Between the bottom of the ice sheet and bedrock, several meters of void, which is now filled with water, maybe 200-300 kilometers wide front, millions of cubic meters per second with this charge. This is what we call a confined flow, high pressure flow, which would cause tremendous erosion, both in the ice and especially in the bedrock. So another arm of that went south, overflowed the Great Lakes, cut the Niagara Gorge and Niagara Falls in a geological instant, the whole St. Lawrence River, and ran into the Atlantic. In northern Saskatchewan, we have these things which are drumlins and similar features, but that's evidence for massive flow. The whole vision of the drumlins today has changed, particularly because of the work of Professor John Shaw at the University of Alberta. They're actually water flow features, not ice flow features. So that's the ice, the water flowing underneath the ice. I'd like to share with you how this flood has been actually discovered. How the evidence in the field finally made geologists click. It's not that they were desperately looking for more catastrophes. No. It's just that they were trying to explain a mysterious climate episode known as the Younger Dryas, or Dryas 4. You see, the Dryas is a plant that grows in the tundra. And every single time we find its pollen in sediments, that is evidence of a cold climate. The 4 such episodes in the Quaternary, the uppermost is known as Dryas 4 or Younger Dryas. And what happened in there is that although we are in the middle of the melting of the ice, the end of the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, suddenly, mostly in the northern hemisphere, and in places for less than 1,000 years, the temperature drops 10 degrees centigrade. They had no explanation for this, based on our knowledge of climate. This happens according to the evolutionist timescale about 13,000 years in the past. In the process of trying to explain this episode, the engine that drives climate on Earth came to be discovered. It is called the Global Thermohaline Ocean Circulation System. And in a simplified way, it goes like this. I'm just using a simplified scheme here. So warm equatorial water from the Atlantic moves up this path and then this path, and it releases a part of its heat. Now when I say it moves, imagine 20 times more water than the sum of all rivers on Earth. This is how much water in the ocean moves in there. As it releases a part of the heat, of course, keeps that area much warmer. The Gulf Stream is one of the expressions of this system, but not all of it. And as it releases heat, it evaporates partially, therefore it becomes saltier, therefore heavier, therefore it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So you have it in dark purple, flowing along the entire Atlantic Ocean on the bottom of it, until it joins the so-called circumantarctic deep water system. And then there's another arm which goes flowing on the bottom of the ocean, the Pacific, all the way up here north of the tropic. It upwells in this area, which is probably the best fishing ground in the world, fishing area actually in the world, because it brings the nutrients from the bottom. Then it starts flowing on surface and becoming warmer and warmer, runs along the equator, half the Pacific, crosses the Sunda Straits, causing the monsoon in North Australia, the Indian Ocean, and it returns into the Atlantic. Such a circuit is closed in 1,000 years. So the water that starts here returns here 1,000 years later. And it's driven entirely by two elements. Thermos, in Greek, means heat. Halos means salt. So the system's dynamics is controlled by the amount of salt and heat in the water. Now try to imagine what happens if you suddenly input a huge amount of fresh, cold water coming from Lake Agassiz into the system, driven by temperature and salinity. It's going to disrupt it. And that is what caused the Younger Dryas. Now this scenario, of course, has been grabbed by Hollywood and exaggerated the way they do it. I shouldn't even say exaggerating, because you say Hollywood, that's what it means. It's a synonym. But anyway, in the film that you might have seen The Day After Tomorrow, right? But this is a real climate process, and this is actually the real engine that drives climate on. Now, traces, evidence for subglacial flood. Remember that flood, high pressure flow underneath the ice, have been found, for example, in Antarctica as well, in the driest spots on Earth, the dry belt. They'll have it. It's known as the labyrinth. And all those meandering channels are the result of water flowing under high pressure between the bottom of the ice and the bedrock. And to poor Lyell's dismay, I should think, probably he spins in his grave, it turns out now the English Channel itself is the result of a catastrophe in the recent past. You see, France and England were connected through the Well d'Artois anticline, a land bridge here, mostly made of chalk. Where the North Sea is now, a lot of meltwater from the melting North European glaciers was accumulating, and when the water was too much to be held by this land bridge, it overflowed the land bridge, and it caused 2 consecutive flooding events. And you can imagine how the speed increased, and as it started carving, so the channel was actually carved in 2 catastrophic events. We have here the high definition, high resolution, survey of the bottom of the channel, and all those elongated shapes are unmistakably evidence for flooding, catastrophic flooding. So there are floods everywhere now. One might even say that floods became uniformitarian. By the way, there are floods, they believe, the scientists, on Mars. Actually, a biblical proportion flood on Mars, they said, which of course has no water. But they will not accept the flood on Earth, which is 2/3 water. There's some indication of flow on Mars. Could be water, could be something else. Now, on one occasion, I was walking on the beaches of the Black Sea in my native country, and it just dawned on me, wait a minute, if the story of Noah's flood is true, and it was global, there should be stories, myths, and legends about floods all around the world, since we all descend from 4 original couples. Now, what is the real situation? Well, here's a summarized situation. You have the numbers of stories, myths, and legends about floods of all inhabited continents, except, of course, Antarctica, which is not inhabited. And you notice the largest number is actually in North America, not in the Middle East, which has the lowest number. If this was just a Middle Eastern story. The grand total is 240 stories about a flood. And all these stories have at least 4 common elements, common themes. The first one is there was an immoral cause for the flood. The flood was a punishment in all 240. One man is warned about the coming of the flood, and he takes measures to save himself, the family, and the animals. All life was destroyed except the one saved by the person warned by God. And the last common element in all 240 stories is the fact that there's an animal, usually a bird, that announces the retreat of the waters or the emergence of land. In all 240. It's a bit too much to believe it is a coincidence. Let us see now some flood-related mythological characters. To the Sumerian culture, Noah's equivalent is known as Ziusudra, And he goes pretty much through the same elements, but even more stunningly similar is the story of Utnapishtim, of the Akkadic Babylonians. He builds this huge square boat and puts his family and animals in it. And later on, after the flood, the famous hero Gilgamesh pays him a visit to ask him about where the flower that gives you eternal life is hidden. Now, what do you think the name of Noah would be for the ancient Hawaiians before the Europeans ever made it that far? Nu'u. And actually, according to the story, after the flood, the god Kane, who saved Nu'u, puts the rainbow into the sky as a sign of his pardon. In southwestern China, there's an interesting people there, the Miao people. And they have an interesting mythology as well. They have a patriarch Dirt in the beginnings. And his offspring are Sete and Lusu. And then they have even a patriarch whose name is Nuwa. And his descendants are Lohan, Loshem, Jakfu, the ancestor of the Miao people, Kusa, and Elan. That's a bit too much, isn't it? They didn't have any contact with the Hebrew people. Since we're in China, let's have a look at the Great Chinese Wall and try to read some writing on the wall, actually a very ancient one. As you know, Chinese use pictograms, not letters, to express themselves. And the one on top is a composite pictogram, made of the 3 pictograms, or sub-pictograms if you wish, I put down there. Now this is believed to be one of the most ancient Chinese writings, about 4,500 years old, according to some specialists. The one on top means a large boat, a large kind of boat. And it's made of the following sub-pictograms. Boat, 8, mouth or people. So 8 people on a boat means a large boat. How many were there on the ark? 8. Now we're getting into, not the meat, but the water of things. Let's deal with this issue of the flood itself as a possible geological hypothesis. You see, if you are to approach this, you have to answer 2 main questions. Where did the waters of the flood come from? And where did they go? If you have a scientific answer for that, you have a good flood scenario. A first attempt coming from Grecian scientists is known as the water canopy or vapor canopy theory. The idea that the pre-flood atmosphere was extremely rich in water. Some basic even on the passage of the scriptures says God separated the waters above and below the firmament. And all that water, maybe even some rings of ice in the outer atmosphere, pretty much like Saturn had, caused the flood as they condensed. Interesting ideas in here, but there's a major problem with this model. It's based on existing global climate models that we have, which we can run based on this idea. And if there was this much water in the atmosphere, we have a problem. You see, unlike what the politicians tell us, the number 1 greenhouse gas is not carbon dioxide, it's water vapor. It accounts for about 75% of the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide accounts for about 20%. But it is a political gas, so that's why it's mainly out there. Now, if we had this much water in the atmosphere, that would have caused a greenhouse effect so powerful that the temperature on the surface of the Earth would have been around 450 degrees centigrade. Pretty much like Venus. That doesn't work. We cannot use this model. Another attempt came from Walt Brown, is known as the hydroclase theory. In other words, that the water was not in the atmosphere, but rather a continuous layer of water, about a kilometer thick, inside the Earth's crust, about 15 kilometers down in the crust. And as the crust cracked open, the water was released, and they say this would be the fountains of the Great Deep, which actually has caused the flood. Interesting model. It explains the beginning of plate tectonics, but it itself has a number of very serious problems, most of them connected to geomechanics. You see, the Earth is a succession of concentric spheres, as far as we can tell. Inner core, outer core, mantle, and crust. And because the planet is spinning, and each in such sphere has a different density, there's a little bit of a lag between them, and that creates certain tensions in there, which express themselves in a number of different ways. Now, if you add a continuous layer of water inside the Earth's crust, 15 kilometers from the surface, which is very close to the surface, and the angular momentum there is pretty high, that's going to literally equivalent to a layer of ball bearings. It's going to pulverize the crust above. And then if you claim that that water was expelled rapidly to the surface, that means that the crust above it had to vertically drop 1 kilometer. That would have further pulverized the crust. So you cannot hold this model. So what are we going to do now? Well, let us think Occam's razor here. Are you guys familiar with Occam's razor, the principle? Now, William of Ockham was a great member of the scholastic movement, one of the staunchest opponents of Thomas Aquinas, actually, if I'm not mistaken. And he used to say this: if there's more than one explanation for the same facts, the simplest explanation is the good explanation. Today we call it the keep it simple, stupid, or the KISS principle. So we take Occam's razor and scrape the surplus, just keep what's needed in there. So if I was to ask a question like that, and the answer to the two questions is, where did the water come from and where did they go, would be the waters were in the ocean and the water are still in the ocean. Would that be a simple enough answer? It is pretty much Occam's razor. So in other words, all we have to do is to redistribute the waters from the ocean. And this is where a new concept comes into place. It's known as catastrophic plate tectonics. The man who came up with it is arguably the most knowledgeable geophysicist on the planet, at least in terms of computer modeling of the planet itself. Dr. Baumgartner worked for 27 years at the Los Alamos National Laboratories in the States. He also created one of the most expensive research projects, which is directly financed by the US government, is known as Terra. It monitors the Earth's crust movements in real time, three-dimensionally, worldwide. Which means he had to have access to military satellites, and he was always using two interconnected Cray supercomputers, because one couldn't handle everything. You know, Crays used to be the most powerful computers. Now, Dr. Baumgartner simply proceeded to try to find, by modeling on the computer, the most possible probable scenario for the triggering, the beginning of plate tectonics. Because it's quite obvious that plate tectonics was not there from the beginning. It kicked into action sometime later after the planet was created, formed. So, here's just some basic elements of plate tectonics. Remember I told you about the concentrical structure of the Earth. What really matters is that most of the heat generated here in the mantle, which is 2,900 kilometers high, is gonna, or thick, is gonna cause convection currents here. So hot, lighter material rises like this, and it eventually emerges here in the ocean, mid-ocean ridges. It's a system of trenches somewhere about 40,000 kilometers around the planet, on the bottom of the ocean. As the magma reaches the surface, it becomes lava, obviously, and it cools, it solidifies. And there's a new one coming up, and cools, solidifies, and pushes the old one sideways, and more, which leads into a bilateral movement away from the mid-ocean ridge. At the time the crust moves and reaches the continents, which are heavier, it's going to start going underneath it. We call that subduction. So it slips underneath. So these are the two main areas. This is where the crust is created. This is where the crust is consumed, because it will descend further back into the mantle, where it melts. It becomes warmer, and it becomes hotter, and it returns. So it's a way to dissipate the heat inside the Earth. In order to understand how this could have started as a process, Dr. Baumgartner has divided planet Earth, essentially, particularly actually the mantle, in 32 concentrical layers, from the outer core to the crust. And then divided every single such layer in little cells, so that produced 1.3 million cells. Every single such cell was then inputted with all the information that we have. That is, what do we think the density, temperature, pressure, and viscosity will be in any of those 1.3 million cells? When all this was uploaded on the computer, he ran the software. Now, he was not using just a theoretical computer model, he was also using many decades of lab experiments on molten silicates mixed with water. Because according to the model, what we think we have in the uppermost uppermost mantle, the so-called asthenosphere, is a mixture of molten silicates and water. There's actually more water in the mantle than there is in the ocean. So we have lab experiments showing the behavior of such components. And what Dr. Baumgartner discovered as a surprise is when the plates first started sinking, they moved meters per second, not centimeters per year. Today we measure the movement, and it's centimeters per year, about the same speed at which our nails grow. But when the plates first started, they moved meters per second. And you notice this plate is not subducting under a continental plate per se, sinking almost vertically very quickly into the mantle. Literally opening up the mantle here, causing a lot of hot material from there coming up, right? Now here's the computer model proper. John is a good friend and he allowed me actually to use it, and I acknowledge it was his model. What you have here is the mantle, 2,900 kilometers. The coloring code is blue is cold, hot obviously is red is hot. This is time, that means days. That is speed, that means 2.6 meters per second, right? This is what happens to viscosity. And this is where the crux of the entire issue is, because what you have is the crust, which is less dense in principle, with some exceptions, sinking into a more dense rock, which is the mantle. But because of the chemical reactions between the molten material in the mantle and the crust, it creates variations in viscosity, which acts like a pump, sucking in the crust. And you will see that that is not a linear movement. It's a fairly complex mechanism. So I'm going to animate this now. You only have to watch what happens here in the center, and the speed there, maybe even that is the most important. Notice how high the speed will go. And then what's happening here, I'm going to explain also. So, let's have a look. So remember, this is about 1.3 million cells. The volume, actually, it's not in the volume. I forgot mentioning this. Dr. Baumgartner had to use a two-dimensional model because no computer can handle a three-dimensional model even today. Right? So in 3 dimensions, this is even more complex and more obvious. But you might have noticed that the speed went all the way up to 7 meters per second. And essentially in 20 days, the crust, the bottom of the ocean that started sinking here, reached the outer core of the Earth in 20 days. As it starts spreading out, it displaces hot material from the ocean, which comes up and replaces the cold one, which has been recycled inside the Earth's crust. Now, is there evidence such a global scale mantle catastrophe happened recently? Let us just imagine a lab experiment. First, let me just drink a sip of coffee, if you allow me. In a lab, you have a crucible, right? On a Bunsen burner. And in the crucible, you have molten lead. It's been there for enough time for the temperature to be evenly distributed in the mass of the molten lead. So there's no convection currents, right? Because as long as there's some temperature difference in the molten material, you're going to have this convection current trying to even the temperature up. And then suddenly you throw in a piece of cold lead. What is going to happen now? Your lead is going to start melting. But as long as there is a temperature difference there, you will have mixing, convection currents. Hot material goes up, cold material sinks. You can use thermodynamics to calculate the precise time you need for that to happen. Now, if we claim that 4,500 years ago, the entire pre-flood ocean floor has been recycled inside the Earth's mantle and went all the way down to the core, 4,500 years is not enough to have this melted and homogenized. So we should see, by way of temperature contrast, therefore density contrast, huge chunks of colder rock than normal inside the mantle and on top of the core. Is that reasonable enough? You understand it? By the way, anytime there's something you do not understand, just let me know. I by all means, welcome interruptions if it helps explain things further. So let's look inside the Earth now. You know that we only have one way to do that. By shock waves, seismic waves. Because the deepest we've ever bored into the Earth's crust is 12.2 kilometers, which is nothing. I mean, the center is 6,370 some kilometers down. So by using shock waves, today we got a technology to actually produce a seismic tomography, that is a CAT scan of the Earth. And here we have the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere. So the grey stuff in the center is the Earth's core. Red means rock which is abnormally hot. Blue means rock which is abnormally cold. No color means normal temperature rock inside the mantle. Green is the ring of fire of the Pacific, and yellow is the continents. And this is obviously the Eastern Hemisphere. Then we have Africa, there you see the Atlantic. All underneath this Atlantic we have these huge chunks of cold rock. So there you have it. Underneath the subduction zones, where the plates are still sinking today, we have huge chunks of cold rock in the mantle, the size of continents. It could have not been there for more than 4,500, 5,000 years max. Because if it was there for a longer time, the thermal contrast would be much less than that. It proves that the Genesis flood was triggered by global tectonics. As the pre-flood supercontinent was breaking apart, the ocean floor was recycled inside the mantle, and the newly formed floor and the ensuing new continents were moved up and down. I'm going to go back to that, but before I do that, let me show you that there is evidence that something like that happened on another planet in the solar system. In the 90s, the Magellan missions had provided the first high-resolution pictures of the surface of Venus using radar. We have today even more than that. But it shows that the entire planet has been resurfaced in the recent times, mostly by basalt flows which come from inside the planet. Here's a radar picture of it. We call those gridded plains. And we know they're new because there are hardly any meteorite impacts. If it's been there for a longer time, you'll have meteorites impacting. So, the tectonic mechanism triggered the flood, is henceforth going to be called catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT. So let's see some geological works of the CPT here. How do I explain the flood through it? Here's a simplified graph showing how the cold seafloor sinks very quickly and drags a little bit of the continents down. And you have the new seafloor emerging from deep underneath. Of course, where it touches where most of the heat is, the water in the ocean is going to be boiling. That's going to create steam jets, which are going to be forced through the entire ocean, expelled, emerging from the ocean, running through the atmosphere, and probably all the way into outer space. But a good part of it will condense into thick clouds and return as rain. So it's sort of a conveyor belt dissipating the heat. Now it's interesting to notice that for the ancient Hebrew, the great deep was not the land, it was the ocean. So the fountains of the great deep means the ocean itself opened up and released the waters over the land. You might have noticed that there is a difference in there, a step, a threshold. Because the new ocean floor is warmer, therefore less dense, bigger in volume. According to the model, that difference is a mile. So the new ocean floor that replaced the old one was a mile higher than the old one. So in other words, you have diminished the volume of the ocean globally with a vertical mile. What is that going to do? That's simplified here. Here's the picture of what we believe was a supercontinent before the flood. Now, why do I say it was a supercontinent? Number of reasons. One of them, dinosaurs. We do have almost identical dinosaurs preserved as fossils in Alaska and in Antarctica. And dinosaurs, I mentioned before, were exclusively land animals. They had to walk on land to get from one place to the other. There must have been a supercontinent. And this is the best distribution of it from North Pole to South Pole. This would keep as much as possible of the angular momentum of the planet without disbalancing the rotation, especially so if it was narrower equatorially. So the first stage of the flood is the inundation. you push literally the ocean floor up, and that's going to push the waters over the continent. Is there evidence for that on land? Well, let's start with the fact that 98% of all known sediments are on land, not in the ocean today. The ocean contains very little sediments, but that's not all. Let's go to this place, the Grand Canyon. See, if you take the Dry Painted Trail, which means you descend from the southern rim down to the bottom, and you come up, and you eventually end up there on the north rim. Once you get at that point, this is what you see. The Coconino sandstone resting on top of the Hermit Shale. You notice how nice and smooth that boundary is? Well, according to standard geological interpretation, there are 10 million years missing between the two. In other words, after the Hermit Shale was deposited, for 10 million years, the top of it was exposed to erosion until the Coconino sandstone was laid on top of it. How come it's so smooth? Then it's been out there for erosion for 10 million years. You look around the Grand Canyon, from top to bottom, they say it was carved in less than 1 million years. How come you don't have a Grand Canyon on that layer over there? How come you don't have canyons on each and every one of these layers? Because they all have been exposed for millions of years until the overlaying layer was laid on top of them. The reason is very obvious, because all these sequence of sediments from the Great Uniformity to the top have been laid down by fast-moving water during the flood. And we can repeat this in a lab, in what we call a flume. You have a flume, a big tank, which contains water mixed with sediments. Coarse, medium, fine. And if you have this water flowing fast, you know what's it going to do? Even if it flows this way, it's going to lay layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of smoothly bound sediment. So that is what you find in the Grand Canyon. That's evidence for a major flood and depositing over 1 kilometer of sediment. Now what happens after the inundation? Evidence for that comes from another canyon. Only this is the biggest canyon that we know thus far in the world. But this is not on the surface of the land, it's on the bottom of the ocean. The Monterey Canyon. That's the Bay of Monterey in California, that's the peninsula of Monterey, the city of Monterey, the famous aquarium is over there. You see, this is longer, wider, and deeper than the Grand Canyon. And this is carved in igneous rocks. Much harder than the sedimentary rocks the Grand Canyon has been carved. Now, can you imagine a mechanism that can create something like this on the bottom of the ocean? Not within the evolutionary scenario, but we have one in catastrophic plate tectonics and the flood. Here it is. After this has been entirely consumed, recycled inside the earth, the movement of the plates will slow down because now the mechanism is different. So that would allow enough time for this to cool. As it cools, it shrinks. As it shrinks, it goes down, so the ocean becomes deeper again. So the waters are going to run back from the continents. As you lower the bottom in the second stage, the recession, the water is going to run back into the oceans. Now, if you try to imagine North America covered with about 2-3 kilometers of water, initially it flows as a sheet of water over the entire continent. It's a tremendous amount of erosion. But in time, it's going to start creating huge channels, which is actually the landscape we have today, most of it. But as it gets on the very edge of the continent, it's going to start channelized. So from a sheet flow, it becomes channelized flow. That's how the Monterey Canyon could have been carved. Here's more evidence for it. The Wollongong waterfalls in New South Wales in Mexico. See, the layers here are virtually vertical, standing almost upright. And some of them are hard, some of them are soft. I actually have walked up there. And if this has been exposed to erosion for millions of years, you should have an uneven relief, right? The hard rocks still standing, the soft ones being washed away. Oh, no, it's just flat. It's like a huge bulldozer ran it over. It's the receding waters of the flood, flattening everything. And here in North America, we have tremendous, they're actually called leveling surfaces. And you have plenty of them in the Rockies. In Montana, you have leveling surfaces 3,000 meters high. And you have huge boulders the size of a house on top of them. Now, some will say, oh, wait a minute, that's Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in Europe, 4,810 meters. Was that covered by the waters of the flood? How about Mount Everest, twice as high? Mind you, on Mount Everest, at 8,500 meters, we have the famous, to mountaineers, it's actually infamous, yellow band. This is when they start having problem with oxygen because it's 8,500 meters high. But that yellow band is a layer of limestone containing sea fossils. Now, is that to say that the mountain was covered by the ocean? Of course not. The mountain was not there. The sediments that are now 8,500 meters high were on the bottom of the ocean, and they were pushed up by what? By the collision of India with Asia. That's what buckled up the sediments and raised them into the mountains. That's how we get high mountain ranges. Then, what happens when the plates on the bottom of the ocean subduct? They're going to create deep ocean trenches. Now listen to what Commander Cousteau, some of you might remember him, had to say. Were the crust of the Earth, to be level, with great mountain ranges like the Himalayas and the ocean abysses like the Mariana Trench, even now, no land at all would show above the surface of the sea. Earth would be covered by a continuous sheet of water more than 10,000 feet deep. So overwhelming the ocean seems to be. But that was the situation before the flood. If we didn't have plate tectonics, we did not have high mountain ranges, neither did we have deep ocean trenches. It's interesting that we have some indirect reference to the scripture. Words like ice and snow are mentioned for the first time in the 6th chapter of the book of Job, which is after the flood. And that seems to point to two things. First, that the climate before the flood was much milder and even across the planet, so there were no what we call climate zones or climate contrasts. Number two, mountains were not high enough to have a permanent snow line, as we have today. On Mount Hebron, for example, in the Middle East, we do have a permanent snow line. Well, if there was no plate tectonics, the mountains were probably less than 2,000 meters high, the created mountains, by the way. And the oceans were, on the average, 2,000 meters. So there's enough water in there to cause the flood, if you think of it this way. And that's before plate tectonics. Now let's see some consequences, some geological features generated by the Genesis flood. I've chosen just a few of them. There are many, of course. But I find these being quite interesting. This is known as the whaleback anticline in Shamokin County, Pennsylvania. This is a coal mining area. It looks like the back of a whale, doesn't it? It is actually an anticline where the layers are bent like this. And one of the sides of it has a fossil tree there, standing upright, as you can see here. So the layers are dipping this way, but the tree is standing upright where the hammer is. I put up a drawing there so it explains it better. So you have the anticline, the whaleback, and the tree is standing like this. Now, according to geology, after the rocks had formed and in them was this fossil tree, they were pressed, compressed, and then they bent. Now, how come the tree is like that? It should have been either like this or broken into pieces. Let me explain this in a very simple example here. You get a deck of cards, right, plastic cards. Then you put a toothpick between them, and you bend them. Would you expect the toothpick to cut through the plastic cards to remain upright like that? No, it's either going to be aligned on one of the flanks or broken, if it is closer to the apex. Now that shows us that the only way to explain such a feature is the following. You have initially a tree trunk buried in sediments, mud, sand, lime, which are soft, unbound sediments. And they are compressed and they bend. But a tree which is solid is going to try to stay perpendicular to the forces, so it's going to stay upright, cutting through the sediments and remaining like that. Then later you have solutions coming from below, which means hot liquids containing lots of minerals. And they will replace the organic matter in the tree with mineral matter, so it petrifies the tree. And the same solutions will bind the grains together, so a sand becomes a sandstone, a mud a mudstone, a lime a limestone. How could this happen? The flood. You see, remember I told you that the plates are sinking fast, going all the way down to the core. If they move 7 meters per second, they would drag with them from the oceans huge amounts of water and water-laden sediments. Now you submit the water in the mantle down there at pressures and temperature of the kind that we have in the mantle, that's going to turn them into volatiles. That's how the geologists call them. Very hot solutions, much lighter of course, and laden with minerals. And they are going to migrate towards the surface, all over the earth. But try to imagine that you have a huge basin here, filled with sediments laid down during the flood. 10 kilometers, 15, 20, 30 kilometers of sediments laid down by the massive erosion during the flood, in which you have buried creatures, animals and plants. You are going to have those fossilized. That is the organic matter replaced with mineral matter, and then the grains bound together, so you're going to have cemented, proper rocks. You know that nobody has ever seen fossils forming today? A fossil doesn't mean to encase a dead creature into rock. It means to replace the organic matter in the creature with mineral matter, and nobody can do that today. Nobody's ever seen it happen. Encasing, yeah. I think one of the cases appears to be Jimmy Hoffa, right? You see they're putting in concrete. I don't know. Now, there is evidence for this happening very clear. The Beijing anomaly, all throughout Asia, but centered under the city of Beijing, there's a huge anomaly 1,000 kilometers down in the mantle, which is essentially water. Now, here's the good part of it. Do you have it? That's the volume equivalent to the Arctic Ocean. How do you get water in the fire, in the mantle, 1,000 kilometers down, unless you have these fast-dragging plates that bring the water with them? That's the only way to explain it. And here's one case that by itself blows up entirely the only existing evolutionary theory about how coal forms. That theory is known as the marsh theory. Ancient forests were falling, the trees, dead trees were falling into the marshes, which are acidic. So the wood would not rot. It would just be preserved in acidic water, slowly covered by sediments, and then the sediments subsided lower and lower and lower until the pressure and temperature was at such that turned the wood into coal. Well, here you have it. This tree starts, fossil tree, starts in a layer of coal, runs through a layer of limestone, and ends in another layer of coal. There's no way that this is a slow burial, is it? Coal here, coal there, no coal in here. You can't have such a selective process if the marsh model is correct. And finally, the sheer presence of limestone here completely rules out an acidic environment. When we have heartburns, which means an excess of acid, what do we take? Mistakenly. Tons or similar stuff, which is what? An alkaline product, which kills the acid and ruins the whole system, right? Because actually the drop in acidity is so sudden that your stomach says, hey, I don't have acid, I need to produce some more. So produce more. So this is an endless cycle. The simplest solution is to take 2 teaspoons of organic apple cider vinegar, put it in a glass of water, drink it, and your stomach says, hey, I'm too acidic here, let's reduce acid, you're all fine. But anyway, the presence of limestone here proves that that could have not been an acidic environment, right? But that's clear evidence for the flood. Trees buried like that. Now, of course, if Noah's flood was global, the one thing we have to deal with is Noah's Ark. Why is it that all these children's storybooks depict the Ark as an overcrowded bathtub? I wonder. Why don't they read the scripture? The scripture is clear about the size of the Ark. There you have it. Pretty much like Contention. And here's a real story. Years ago, I shared this with a friend of mine, a naval engineer. And he said to me, you know what, mind your own geology, Emil. Nobody, even the high-tech shipyards today, can build something like that, which is flat bottom, keelless, barge-like boat the size of the Titanic. No way. And have also this thing float on the water and carry anything. Which is breaking to pieces. Well, I'm just a geologist, so I had to accept that. I guess who saved me? National Geographic. They just published a few years ago, I think it's 2005, an article about a famous Chinese expedition which was totally forgotten and now it's been revived more than once at the beginning of the 1400s. Initially it was thought that they went from China to Mozambique, southeastern Africa. Now there's evidence they made it all the way to Venice in Italy. The expedition was under the command of an admiral, which has a statue actually in Beijing now, Zhang He. A typical Chinaman, 7 feet 4. And he had a fleet matching his size. 150,000 people in that expedition with him. Most of them on board of 40 Baochuans. Now, Baochuan is also known as a Ming treasure ship. And they found pieces of Baochuans in the mud on the banks of the Yangtze River in China. And this is the size of it. Pretty much the size of the Ark. A few feet difference in it. And you see the whole fleet of Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese who went around Cape of Good Hope, would have fit on the deck of one Baochuan. Now this is a flat bottom, keelless, barge-like boat made in wood. The fact that naval engineers today cannot build something like this doesn't mean they couldn't do it in the past and navigate more than half the world on board of it. And if you're interested in Zhang He, there's an interesting book just came out now, it's called 1432. And it puts up an interesting hypothesis concerning the end of the expedition. It's fascinating. Traces have been found of Chinese habitation on the eastern coast of the South Island of New Zealand, way before the Maori got there. But Chinese have no record of them going and colonizing New Zealand. So the author speculates that Zhang He's expedition, which never made it back home, ended up in New Zealand, close to it. And in 1432, apparently, there was a comet that hit the Earth, and it's caused a huge tsunami. It hit probably the Pacific, and the tsunami caught the whole Chinese fleet and dumped it on the land. So they were stranded there, and they spent the rest of their lives there, and that's why you have this evidence. Very interesting idea. Anyway, let's look at some conclusions here. Regional floods are now a standard geological feature. There are 240 myths and legends about the flood on all inhabited continents, and all share at least 4 common themes. There are compelling geological and computational arguments that the flood was global and mainly a tectonic event in the recent past. Once ocean waters were pushed over the pre-flood landmass, and later, when the new ocean basins formed, the same waters rushed back, cutting most of the present-day landscape. It is the most important consequence of a global flood. A global flood can explain the vast majority of fossils and sediments in one catastrophic event, which lasted less than 400 days. So suddenly there's no need and no room for billions of years if there was a global flood like that. And here's another thing that we learned from the scripture. Here's Noah and the big gates of the ark inviting everyone to come and be saved. May I speculate that Noah probably hired labor to help him build the ark? And those guys who had worked for 100 years almost, with their own hands and sweat, to build the instrument that could have saved them, did not believe in it. So they didn't come when the flood came, and they died. How many people go to church today with the same concept in mind? Well, I'm not sure about this church thing, but maybe it's just a good thing to be there. Who knows? This is a serious issue. Now that door was closed. By whom? By God himself. And whoever was left outside became a fossil, a memory, or none of those. But there's another door, which is still open. I am the door, said Jesus. By me, if a man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out, and find pasture. You see, we as Christians can only bring people to the door. We cannot push them through it. God does that thing. And it is our duty, once that we accepted that we have a mission from Christ, to bring people to the door. And a good way to do it is by eliminating those barriers that prevent them from accepting the message. This is why I believe it is so important, once again, to be equipped. Not go home with empty hands, but with all those resources, because they will help you do exactly this. And dear friends, I would like to tell you something. And I run a bit longer than I planned, but I need to share this with you. I want you to understand that there is no scientific argument that can convince a consistent atheist that God exists. And I will prove that to you by giving you a hypothetical situation. Imagine God himself comes down on earth to meet an atheist. My favorite atheist is an old Polish philosopher who once said that God wanted him to be an atheist. So he comes down and says, "Hello, son, I'm Yahweh, the God of the Scriptures, the one you don't believe exists. So here I am. Touch me. I know you say I'm not here. Tell me, what miracle would you like me to perform so that you believe I existed?" And the philosopher says, "If you do this, I'll believe." And God does it. It is possible that he will convert and fall onto his knees and ask for forgiveness. But you know what I suspect the philosopher is going to do? He's going to say, "Now wait a minute, I know there is no God. Therefore this cannot be real. Somebody's tampering with my brains. You know, maybe I'm in some sort of a matrix situation. I physically exist in a pod, immersed in a fluid, in a deep state of sleep, with a plug in the back of my head through which a computer supplies me with a virtual reality in which there is a God." See, this is the ultimate escape from any kind of religion. So that's a waste of time trying to convince atheists by way of scientific arguments there is a God. But just as there's no scientific argument that can convince an atheist, a consistent atheist, that God exists, there should be no scientific argument that can convince a consistent Christian that God doesn't exist. It works both ways. Because it all boils down to one thing: your paradigm, your worldview. So you see, these tools are not to convince atheists. No. This is to convince atheists that your thinking is just as rational and scientifically solid as theirs. Because I tell you one thing. When I finish a talk like this in the academia, you know what they tell me? "I don't believe a word of what you said, but it made sense." As Christians is all we need to do amongst atheists. Because then they understand we have not suspended our intellect as we became Christians. On the contrary, we sharpened it. Because we don't only know their view of things, but we have another one as well. That's double witnessing. Because you witness with your changed life and your intellect. And you're suddenly much more interesting a person. That's why it is so important not to bash atheists with them. The last thing you want to do is to bash atheists, because they're going to go into defense mode. They're never going to listen to your arguments. The first thing you need to do is make sure that they understand you're not there to attack them. You're there to share a different view. And once they switch onto listening mode, then you can share. These are important logistics, if you wish. So, we do have some time for questions. It could be on this topic or any other topic. Yes?
About the age of
Age of the Earth. So let's look into the Ice Age per se. And let's use existing global climate models, computer models, right? If you know that they're all a function of your initial conditions. If you upload the conditions that existed at the end of the flood, particularly high evaporation and high precipitation. The Bible describes how the land was dried by big winds. Of course, when you take the water from the ground, where's it going to go? Right? If you also input the new climate system, which resulted from breaking up the supercontinent, therefore the thermohaline circulation changing drastically, and also the vast volcanic activity that existed during the flood, which would create the classical nuclear winter scenario. With all these elements inputted into an existing climate model, within 500 years after the flood, you have a maximum ice age. You see, if you cover about 30% of the northern hemisphere, which would be at least, in the scenario mentioned before, with a layer of white snow, And the precipitation estimates are somewhere around 1,000 millimeters per square meter globally. That's going to cause a sudden, significant increase in the albedo, which is going to cause, of course, a lot of reflection of solar energy back into space, and that results in a catastrophic cooling. As I said, increased by the ash in the atmosphere. So within 500 years after the flood, you have maximum ice age. It extends for about 1,500 years, and then it starts melting, and you still see it melting today. So the flood actually can cause an ice age easily, based on what we know about land.
Does that mean there will not be an ice age because the conditions will not exist anymore?
Yes, an ice age to that extent. You will have pulsations, you know, interstadials and stadials, but the general trend seems to be towards the melting imagery. And actually, if you look into the standard geological paleoclimate models, they say that for the last 600 million years, evolutionary years of the planet, the average temperature on Earth was 22 degrees for 80% of that time. Today is 12 degrees, so we're still in a cold span, kind of going back to normal, warmer conditions.
You said earlier that as the water goes up in the North Atlantic, it disperses heat. If you have a large flow of fresh water, it changes the dynamics.
Yes, it shuts down the system.
So now the ice caps are melting, and all that water, is that going to have some kind of effect? What's going to be the effect, for example?
Well, first, fresh water is less dense than salt water. So the floating of the icebergs is going to be significantly different. But
how will it affect the currents are determined weather patterns, so...
Well, if you shut down the system, it would result in an ice age, pretty much.
So Europe should get colder?
Yes, absolutely. Now, if you extrapolate the same mechanism as existing before the flood, and you had a supercontinent running from the North Pole to the South Pole, then you couldn't have the east-west component of that circulation. So most likely you would have two north-south running cells on the east side and the west side of the supercontinent. Well, that would have created mild and even conditions at the poles. And if that is so, then you could have had a straight axis of the Earth before the flood. Because the main reason why we reject the straight axis before the flood is that would have created extreme conditions at the poles. But with such a circulation system, maybe you could have even conditions. Now, if the axis has tilted after the flood, it's actually because of the dispersion of the continents, because if you split the supercontinent into different smaller pieces, but most of them are in the northern hemisphere, because today we still have more landmass in the northern hemisphere than the southern, then that would have caused the tilting and also the wobbling of the axis. And that would further increase the ice age mechanism and everything else.
So what do you believe about global warming?
Global warming. Well, by the sheer evolution of the terms, one can draw certain conclusions. So it started as global warming, then climate change, now the standard expression is climate disruption. But it so happens that I did work in paleoclimate. You know, I worked actually with the guys from Grenoble, in the Speleological Institute in Grenoble. These are the guys who've done the study of the isotope contents, you know, of the Vostok ice core, which Mr. Gore used in his documentary as the #1 piece of evidence. So the first thing one needs to do when speaking about global warming is to define a point of reference or a time of reference. Warming compared to what? If you use as your frame of reference the medieval maximum or optimum, 600 AD to roughly 900 AD, we're still colder than that. In those years, those are the years when the Vikings have settled in Greenland, and they named Greenland because it was green on the edges, which is not today. There's evidence that the Vikings may have made it all the way to Vancouver Island, which means the Northwest Passage was open, which is not today, the way it was in the time of the Vikings. So yeah, if that's your frame of reference, of course, there's no global warming. But if your frame of reference is, say, the period 1941 to 1972, of course we're in a warming period. I mean, 1941 is the beginning of the harsh winters that basically decided the fate of the Germans in Russia, in the war. It was just a very cold episode, lasting for about 20-some years total. And then, if you read the newspapers and the media from the late 60s, beginning of 70s, you will see that everybody was afraid that the Ice Age is going to hit in about 10 years, just like that. So yeah, then we have been in a warming period, but that has stopped. According to some authors, 10 years ago. According to some other authors, something like 6-7 years ago. So there's nothing in there to point towards this. And you know, the one thing I would like to go back to the carbon dioxide as the culprit. The Vostok ice core comes from a segment of the Antarctic ice sheet, which is the thickest place, 3.2 kilometers. And it's interesting, that's this so-called Dome Sea near Vostok, one of the Soviet, now Russian research stations in Antarctica. So they bored a hole all the way down. It's fascinating. Underneath the ice, there's a lake. Well, it's a freshwater lake. Lake Vostok, they call it, which is about the size of Lake Ontario. The ice was sent to Grenoble for study. You see, they studied the carbon dioxide bubbles inside the ice and the oxygen isotopes in the ice. Now, for the carbon dioxide, of course, they established the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when the ice formed. Then from the delta carbon and the delta oxygen isotopes, the estimated temperature. Because the colder the weather, the heavier, the more frequent the heavy isotopes of oxygen. So oxygen of 18 becomes more frequent than 16, than normal. And they also use carbon-14 to date the ice and the layers and all that. So they show in that graph, which covers, it's about this big in Nature magazine from 85 when they published it, and that covers 440,000 years, that for every single peak of carbon dioxide, there's a peak of higher temperature. So there's perfect overlap between the level of carbon dioxide and the temperature, repeatedly. And in the film, Gore actually blows up that to a huge chart and then he climbs up to show where it's going. Any serious climatologist would tell you, Mr. Slow down, hold your horses. You cannot build climate trends at a resolution of 10,000 years. Because on this much, 440,000 years, the highest resolution they can get, that is the minimum division between two consecutive divisions, actually 10,000 years, which is too much, too long. Now they increased that resolution to less than 1,000 years. And they discovered that the order is totally in reverse. What the ice has preserved as information is that first the temperature goes up, and within about 800 years, carbon dioxide goes up. Why is that? Any oceanologist will tell you. The number one source and sink of carbon dioxide is the ocean, not the atmosphere. The atmosphere contains about 730 gigatons of carbon dioxide. The ocean contains 38,000 gigatons. So, if you warm the water in the ocean, it's going to start releasing carbon dioxide. You have two pots, identical. One is cold, the other one is warm. You open them, which one loses the gas first? The warm one. So you warm the ocean, it's going to release carbon dioxide. You cool the ocean, it's going to take carbon dioxide and fix it. And that's exactly what happens. So it looks like in the past, as the temperature was going up, most likely because of the sun, then carbon dioxide will go up. So there's no evidence whatsoever that in the past carbon dioxide has caused warming. The evidence shows that warming caused more carbon dioxide. So then the whole story goes away. But of course, then you lose some very powerful political instruments. That's what I believe. I don't buy this scenario at all. Just plain and simple, based on evidence. And there's a large community of scientists who have exactly the same position. Now, some of them have actually ran into serious trouble because of it. But now the group is growing, and I think it's just a matter of time until the whole thing is going to just fizz away. Because there's another thing that happened. You know, the sun has gone through its calmest period ever recorded by humans. 2 years with no spots. And that has triggered cooling significantly. So there are some scientists now that predict 10-year period, maybe 30-year period of cooler climate because the sun's less heat output because of the changes in the solar activity. Yes?
I was interested what your answer would be to carbon dating.
Carbon dating. Well, let's look into carbon dating first, how it works. First, I need to ask this. I know there are many scientists here, I don't want to offend them, but would the rest be kind of okay if I explain what an isotope is first? Would that help, or are you pretty familiar with the concept of an isotope? Okay. You see, what defines a chemical element, that is its atom, is the core, the nucleus that has two particles, protons and neutrons, and then the electrons that spin around, right? Now, the protons have electrical charge +1, mass 1. Neutrons have no electrical charge but mass 1. And the number of protons has to be equal to the number of electrons, right? Or the electrons, the number of protons, because the electrons have negative charge -1, right? But most of the mass of the atom comes from the nucleus, because the electrons have very, very tiny mass. And the mass is given by the sum of protons and neutrons, right? Because they both have mass 1. Now, if you add more neutrons to the nucleus, you're going to increase the mass of it, but you're not going to increase its electrical charge. So therefore, you don't need more electrons. Well, that is an isotope. In other words, a fat atom. It's more weight. It's the same thing. Isotopos in Greek means the same shape. You see, in the nuclear world, extra fat is shed naturally, unlike in ours, unfortunately. So that extra fat is actually, the loss of mass is actually radioactive decay. Carbon-14 has 3 isotopes. 12, which is the vast majority. Carbon-13, which is about 3.5%, I believe. And then carbon-14, which is much, much less than that. But carbon-14 is the fattest one. It's the only one that decays. It decays through beta decay back into nitrogen-14, from which it comes. It comes from the higher atmosphere, where nitrogen-14 under cosmic bombardment turns into carbon-14. Now, carbon is incorporated by every single living creature continuously, as long as they're alive. We exchange carbon dioxide with the environment. There's carbon-14, 13, 12 in there. The water we drink, the carbohydrates we eat. Carbon-14 decays, because it's radioactive. But since you're taking in continuously new carbon, the ratio between carbon-12 and 14 is constant. When you die, whatever carbon-14 was there starts decaying away, and there's no other carbon-14 to replace it. So in time, you're going to have less and less and less and less carbon-14. Based on that, and the fact that we have measured the half-life, that is the pace at which it decays, in 250,000 years, there should be no more carbon-14 in any item that had carbon in it. Unfortunately, carbon-14 was discovered in items which are known, quote-unquote, to be 250 million years old, at cold. Carbon-14 was found in Precambrian graphite, which is, according to standard geological time frame, more than 545 million years old. Carbon-14 was found even in diamonds, which are over 2 billion years old. Again, there shouldn't be carbon-14 there after 250,000 years. So there's a problem, a serious problem there. And that's not all. I'll give you another one. In 1970, in the permafrost of the Yukon, a perfectly frozen muskox was found. It was so well preserved that they could radiocarbon date the muscles on the back of its head and the hair on the back. Fur. Now the muscles yielded the radiocarbon age of 24,000 years. The hair 17,000 years. It's questionable the animal could have lived for 7,000 years. So what actually happened here is the following. See, muscles grow slower than hair. Well, maybe I'm wrong now because I've seen some gyms with steroids you can reverse this order, but that seems to be it. So by the time the muscles grew, the average amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere was less than the amount of carbon-14 when the hair grew. Because the more carbon-14, the younger it appears to be, the less carbon-14, older it appears to be. What it shows us is that during the lifetime of a muskox, which I believe on the average is 35 years or so, the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere changed so much as to skew the dating to 7,000 years. So guess what? Carbon-14. Serious problems. Now I remember once I gave a talk, and at the end, this lady comes to me, she said, you see, I worked for 27 years in a carbon-14 dating lab as a technician. And I ran that protocol millions of times. And oftentimes, she says, I ended up at the end of it when I should have 0 carbon-14, but I still had carbon-14. So I went to the boss and said, boss, what are we doing here? There's no contamination, everything is fine, I still have carbon-14. And the boss would tell me, don't worry, we're going to adjust the numbers. There's no accident that 60% of carbon-14 datings are rejected by archaeologists. They just don't seem to fit their dating based on other methods. Now you can ask questions in French if you feel so. It's fine. Yes. Right. Wait. So what do we do about the Earth's magnetic reversals, North Pole, South Pole? The gentleman says they do that periodically. Well, it's not that much of a periodic thing, because the last one happened according to standard interpretation 740,000 years ago. It's well overdue. But what does explain magnetic reversals? Why is it that the North Pole becomes south and flips back and forth? And we have this recorded in rocks. There's no question about it. Well, it's funny that the only model that can explain reversals completely is the catastrophic plate tectonics model. Because only the catastrophic plate tectonic model, you have plates running across the entire mantle, separating the mantle into smaller entities, and that could cause the reversals. So there's a complete explanation. You can find it on our website. Now the question is, how many? Well, according to the catastrophic plate tectonics, you could have a dozen reversals every week during the flood. There's plenty of stuff, but it doesn't have to be regular. It is not regular. You see, it's not like a perfect cyclicity. However, there's an interesting thing here which I would like to point out. We do have continuous measurements of the Earth's magnetic field for about the last 130 years. There's a very clear trend in there, undoubtedly. It decreases. Many believe that this is an indication of the upcoming next reversal. However, if you start extrapolating the curve, how long it takes for it to get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, and then you assume at some point it becomes 0. And then it flips, and it takes the same time to go back to normal, but in reverse polarity. That will give you intervals of the magnetic field being so weak or non-existent that will cause a lot of cosmic radiation and bad things to come down on Earth. And since we had so many reversals recorded in the rocks, and if every single reversal happens according to the same scenario, why is there still life on Earth? Life should have been destroyed quickly if we had so many times no magnetic field. So that's why I believe that the flips were very quick. Several hours, flip-flop, during the flood. Once that mechanism was finished, once the entire pre-flood ocean crust ocean floor was consumed inside the mantle, then the whole thing shuts down. And that's why we don't have any more reversals. So I believe that the weakening of the Earth's magnetic field has nothing to do with a reversal. If you ask me if this is a sign of end times, could be. It's the most serious of them. Much more serious than the warming or whatever. Actually, I call these guys the warm mongers. Yeah.
Like creation versus intelligent design. Because I thought intelligent design was like this kind of nice way to say, the creation. But then I read something that intelligent design is kind of separate. Or,
well,
I don't know. Do you have any
semantics? There's no creation versus intelligent design because, what creation is an intelligent design. No, it has to do with the infrastructure of things. You see, intelligent design has been repeatedly accused, intelligent designers have been repeatedly been accused by evolutionists and staunch atheists, you know, Richard Dawkins, the unholy trinity first, you know, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, or no, Sam Harris, that they're just hidden creationism. Well, of course it's not hidden creationism, it's overt creationism. If you speak of intelligent design, there is an intelligent designer. Who's the creator? Hello? But they, intelligent designers, say, no, we don't say that. We believe in millions of years, we believe in evolution, but everything is design. So there is a line within the intelligent design which basically points to the fact that this is one of the many universes, and if there's a larger universe, multi-dimensional universe, let's say it's fifth dimensional, sixth dimensional, seventh dimensional, we're just part of it, and those guys designed us, and blah, blah, blah. They basically got so scared by the wild, ferocious attacks of the evolutionists, and there's a book we carry there, it's called The Slaughter of the Dissidents, how guys who dare mention they believe in intelligent design, they lose their jobs, they lose their tenures, they lose their research funds, everything. So that they tried to turn it around a little bit because they were very, very much under attack. But there's no separation there, and we do carry some of their materials. We have the politically incorrect guide to intelligent design, for example, and some other books, and the famous DVD, The Unlocking the Mysteries of Life. They do an excellent job. You see, we see the intelligent design movement as the academic dimension of the creationist work. You know, in the academia, you don't talk about God, Yahweh, and all that, because it's too much of a shock. You basically aim your work towards destroying this mental barrier of the existence of God. That there is a God, there is a designer, you know, that's your first step. And I believe that intelligent design is the science of the future. I mean, it's building fast, it's going the right direction as far as I'm concerned. There is a separation in terms of we're not doing the same thing, you know, because they don't accept us. And you need also to understand that members of the intelligent design movement are not just Christian. They come from many different religions. And if you start pounding your chest that, no, it's only our God, then you lose the other guys. And that's not the purpose of that movement, I guess. So, yeah. But if you hear that there's some antagonism, it's just because of what they would like to see happening. But it's unavoidable. I mean, we use intelligent design arguments oftentimes because they're so good, it's so obvious. Yes.
Qu'est-ce qu'on sait du changement de l'axe de la Terre?
So what do we know about the changes in the axis of the Earth, tilting of the Earth's axis? Est-ce que vous voulez que je réponde en français ou ça va en anglais? So I was saying that it is so much easier and helps a lot as young Earth creationists if we believe in a straight axis before the flood and the tilting happening because of the flood, as I just mentioned before. But the number one reason why most creationists reject that is because they have no solution to the problem of extreme conditions at the poles. Because if you have a straight axis, this is where the solar radiation is going to be tangential, so you lose most of the heat. Now, we have clear fossil evidence, and some of the most spectacular comes from here in Canada, Axel Heiberg Island, and just a number of other islands out there north, in which you see on the Axel Heiberg, for example, there's ancient forests, you still have the tree stumps, and you can burn the wood. They call it mummified wood, and they call it metasequoia. It's sequoia. And you have so many stumps that you can clearly see it was a forest. But that's 85 degrees north. So it's above the Arctic Circle. How could you have trees growing in forests, sequoias growing in forests, where it's 6 months of darkness? That doesn't work like that. They found needles, branches, all very fresh. And then they even found Champsosauruses, which is actually a relative of the Komodo dragon. And recently they found some hadrosaurs, so dinosaurs, on the surface. So it's obvious the climate was warm in it. How could you have a warm climate if you had a straight axis? You know? But as I said, the reason for that, I believe, is the ocean circulation system, which was different before the flood, because if you have a supercontinent, from the North Pole to the South Pole, then essentially the east-west component of the thermohaline circulation, remember, it goes around Antarctica and then goes up north, and then crossing the Indian Ocean as well. You won't have that if you have a landmass from pole to pole. So most likely you will have two north-south cells on the east side and the west side of the continent, and that could have actually created even conditions at the poles, so keep warm conditions. So I personally believe that, excuse me, that the axis of the Earth was straight before the flood, and it tilted because of the flood and the shifting of the continents. And that explains a number of other things as well.
But if you have a straight axe and the sun's coming, you don't have sunlight on both, so how can you have trees?
Well, you didn't have them on the pole. You had 85 degrees here. Suffice to have enough.
Oh,
light.
okay, not on the top.
Right on the pole. There's no continent on the pole right now. And I don't think it was even then.
You've been explaining the flood and what happened in terms of what happened on the Earth, like the crust breaking up and so on. Could there be evidence, or is there something that could have happened, let's say, at the solar system level or cosmological level to explain or trigger that event?
Now, there's been a debate amongst creation scientists ever since the catastrophic plate tectonics was first brought up in 1990. What actually triggered plate tectonics? There's a number of different mechanisms we can speculate on. One would be the intrinsic instability at the bottom of the mantle, the bottom of the crust, the top of the mantle, the so-called astenosphere. Astenosphere means weak sphere in Greek, right? So it's a mixture of silicates and water, and any chemical change could cause a disbalance and trigger sinking. But most of us believed, and still believe, that it was a meteorite impact which has triggered it. And then a fascinating coincidence, 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, specialists in plate tectonics, evolutionists of course, have met in California discussing exactly the same topic. And they came to the conclusion, and this is now the standard interpretation, that it was a meteorite impact that triggered plate tectonics.
Well, God did not trigger it?
Well, of course. it's just, did God use natural causes all the way through, or at some point it was something miraculous? Because if it's a meteorite, why is it that it hit exactly what needed to cause the flood and destroy the population? That would be a question, you know. So I'm not trying to speculate where, because God could have just done that to a meteorite and sent it our way, and then the whole thing goes from there. But God could have already programmed that meteorite to be there and hit the Earth at the right moment. I don't know. Because ultimately you have to explain the primary cause of everything, and that would be God, of course. But if plate tectonics runs the way we see it, and we look at the many scars on the planet in terms of meteorites, and you kind of get rid of the standard interpretation, separating them by deep geological time, then yes. And you might have had a lot of meteorite bombardment during the flood, after the land was covered with water, so most of the impacts will not be visible anymore because of what happened afterwards. But I think that the meteorite impact would be the easiest way to trigger it.
Just one, like the Grand Canyon, because you were talking about the ice age and water and all that, but
Yes.
when you were talking about the Grand Canyon, is that from the flood, or
Yeah, it
is
is
that
from the flood.
the ice
Now,
age?
there's from the flood, I have very little doubt about it, but there is a secondary erosion that happened there. It's still catastrophic. It's known as the Lake Hopi flood. So it is quite possible we see a number of places where we have basalt dikes crossing the Grand Canyon. So those were lava flows, vertical flows. And that's what a dike is. And it's quite possible that some of those have caused damming. So, because if you look all the way from, essentially you can start somewhere around Smithers in British Columbia. And you just follow it, you go all the way down into the States, through the Okanagan, and you go further down to Utah, to Lake Bonneville. saw a huge couloir of ancient lakes that all drained catastrophically. So one of those was Lake Hockey. And I believe that's one of the main reasons why in the Grand Canyon, although you had it excavated by the floodwaters, and when the sediments were still fairly soft, you don't have huge debris cones at the foot of the slopes. If you cut a trench in sand by fast-moving water, you'll have the slopes readjusting, and you have a lot of scree and sand flowing down until you reach a balance. We don't have that in the Grand Canyon. The reason why you don't have it, I believe, it was there when the Grand Canyon formed, but then you have the Lake Hopi flood, and that's going to just wash away all that sediment and flush it. So now you have more vertical walls because of that. And I've seen this happening in many other places. One of the spectacular things you can see in the film that we have on Darwin. One of the locations I desperately wanted to see, and we managed to do it, if you remember, on boats all the way up, the Santa Cruz River. Now, the Santa Cruz River is spectacular if you drive into it, because you go into Pampas, it's perfectly flat, and suddenly in front of you there is this 25-kilometer wide valley. Comes down like this. Then there's an inner valley that's about 10 kilometers wide. It's still dry, and then you go further down, and that's where the river is now, meandering at about 3 kilometers. And the river is now just down there. But you can see how this has been initially excavated by a huge amount of water released from Lago Argentino, and then the flow just kind of entrenched itself, and eventually it went down to the bottom. And again, you don't have these shapes, these lateral slopes, because they've been washed. So catastrophic drainage can do interesting things. And one of the reasons why also I believe that North America has the largest number of myths and legends about floods is that the natives have seen this late glacial floods happening. So there's two levels of stories in there. There's the ancient story of the flood, and then the new ones that they've seen. Okay, well, I think this will do it. If there are more questions, I'll be downstairs, so I just want to give you a chance to